Good morning. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Peter, for inviting me to this symposium, and to everyone at the Ackland who's made this possible. I'm especially delighted to be back in North Carolina. I haven't been here since 1985, when I graduated from high school at the North Carolina School of the Arts in Winston-Salem in modern dance, where I was lucky enough to have my teachers invite John Cage backstage after a performance that we had done. So it was really thrilling to see all of the images shown by Mr. Cass with Merce Cunningham as well as John Cage. And I regret that I never had the opportunity to discuss modern dance and calligraphy with Professor Addis, but I'm grateful to have this opportunity over the course of today to contemplate the traces he left behind in terms of his scholarship and his artistic energy, and to have conversations about him with all of you. So today I would like to talk about one artist of the odd couple, just one, and I'd like to focus on a few of the remarkable artifacts by the Buddhist nun Ōtagaki Rengetsu. So here you're looking at one of the most riveting objects. There are many riveting objects, but here's an especially riveting one, a sake decanter by Rengetsu, and it immediately focuses kind of our attention. But it is often a small work, her ceramic works, but these objects can shed light on an array of complexities, even of a number of different categories, including the category of woman artist, and especially when that's used in relation to historical figures. So in my talk today, I also would like to introduce a theoretical framework for considering the unique kind of materialism and embodiment in Rengetsu's work, a reciprocal embodiment that involves not only the maker of the vessel, but the person who encounters it. So I've talked about this in terms of Rengetsu's haptic poetics, which should sound paradoxical. So words are not supposed to be touched like you can with this object. Language is thought to be abstract, symbolic, the opposite of tactile materiality. In the European tradition, the dichotomy between discourse and materiality has also been gendered, with men being aligned with cerebral language or culture, and women with earthy materiality or nature. Rengetsu's work exists outside such a dichotomy, and as we'll see, occupies a place of convergence. But we should also take her identity as a nun seriously, thereby envisioning a Buddhist aesthetics operative in her poetry and artifacts. Rengetsu was active as a painter, poet, and potter for over 50 years after she took Buddhist vows. At the age of 33, while still a mother to a young daughter, but having experienced the death of 3 other children and 2 husbands, she discarded the physical markers of conventional lay femininity. She cut her hair, which would have been one of the main signifiers of her age, gender, and status, and at some point she fully shaved her head, as seen in this posthumous portrait. Unlike lay women, she consistently wore simple, undyed, unpatterned robes, and she took the Buddhist inflected name of Rengetsu, or Lotus Moon. From that point forward, she shifted into an altogether distinct social category of nun, an identity that challenges any easy assumptions about a universal, transhistorical, or transcultural notion of woman. Her life and work present an opportunity to reconsider the familiar binary categories of man/woman, usually conceived as oppressive and monolithic. That is not to say that her status as a nun meant that she was not gendered by society. In her own lifetime, she would be called a female artist and poet. And plenty of lore about Rengetsu plays off her identity as a woman, often stereotypically. By becoming a nun, Rengetsu did not enter a post-gender state. Nun was not a gender-neutral category or social category, and she continued to employ modes of written expression that were deemed most appropriate for women. She consistently used the 31-syllable Waka, for example, as her primary mode of expression, an ancient form that counted female poets among its earliest and greatest practitioners. Rengetsu was famous for her poetry, which published in 2 separate printed anthologies in her own lifetime. which was published. She left behind nearly 1,000 waka. You'll see 41 of them in the exhibition just around the corner. A number multiplied by their repeated inscription on all manner of surfaces, from pottery to poem sheets to hanging scrolls with accompanying paintings. She also consistently employed the phonetic script of kana to record the Japanese language of her poetry. This script was used by everyone, but it was long associated calligraphically with the so-called woman's hand, in contrast to Chinese characters. This generic distinction linked kana to modes of private writing, to waka poetry, and to vernacular narrative tales famously authored by women. Rengetsu's style is immediately recognizable. Her thin brush glides across the surface, producing elegant, gossamer, thin, sinuous curves. The forms are rounded, plump, buoyant, and breezy, the thin lines leaving much empty atmosphere on the surface. Striking examples abound. Here are two fixed fans currently displayed in the exhibition at the Denver Art Museum. And you can see the space where her brush enters the graph. Sometimes it can be barely discernible, and one needs to look closely to see where she slightly pauses, where she lifts the brush from the paper. There are none of the kind of extremely dramatic exit marks that you might see in Nantenbō's work. They're on a different scale. And there are occasional linkages between kana. But here, each kana phoneme is a distinct graph, ready to be vocalized on its own, except for the single character for grass in the very center of the fan, which creates an imagistic grass horizon line, above which the butterfly, as you can read about in the poem, from whose perspective the poem was written, flits from plant to plant in the other columns looking for dew. And it sort of recalls the famous, "Now I wonder, am I a person who dreamt of being a butterfly, or am I a butterfly dreaming that I am a person?" Zhuangzi. To get a sense of Rengetsu's distinctive style, compare her writing to two contemporary women. Sakuragi, her closest emulator, explicitly follows her style, while the writing of Chikago is interesting because it highlights the extreme legibility of Rengetsu's script, a characteristic to which I'll return. Of course, Rengetsu became most famous for adding her script to her pottery. Some scholars say that the act of writing in clay might have shaped her calligraphic style, inscribing the letters against the resistance of the surface, perhaps necessitating a clarity of form. Here you can see the range of types of works that she produced, from teapots and vessels to sake bottles, and you'll see that in the exhibition as well, and to more unusual forms. Rengetsu did not invent ceramic inscription, but she did it in a way that no one had done before, in abundance, with her own original poems on every shape and size of vessel. And now I'd like to turn to the issue of her inscriptions and of her haptic poetics, to consider the unique kind of materialism and embodiment in Rengetsu's work, a reciprocal embodiment that involves not only the maker of the vessel, but the person who encounters it. What I would suggest is that Rengetsu's ceramics prompt an engagement that can cause a physical surrender or submission, a relinquishing of the self to the object, suggestive of an intersubjectivity compatible with Buddhist notions of non-dualism. In this way, despite an imprinting of the identity of woman on the nun, we might explore an aspirational non-binary state or gender fluidity running through Rengetsu's literary artifacts rooted in a Buddhist worldview. This is a view whereby becoming a nun, its renunciation, is an expansive act that increased her capacity to relate to others, to adopt the perspective of others even beyond the human, as we saw with the butterfly poem. To put my conclusion up front, this is a materialist aesthetics that accords with transcending not only gender, but a relinquishing of the self. We can begin by thinking about her ceramics with this example of a sake bottle or a tokuri and a cup that could be used on any number of occasions for example, at the start of a sencha ceremony for a celebratory toast. On many of the small sake cups accompanying these bottles, you find inscriptions that are felicitous in nature. These are ceramics appropriate for use in marking special occasions and for that reason have auspicious poetic verses on them. So, for example, in this small cup here, it bears the poem, "The Young Crane's Timeless Voice," heard through the ages. It sings of an imperial reign that lasts for 1,000 generations. This poem alludes to the longevity of an imperial reign, but also longevity in general for those who would experience life and whose descendants would experience life through the temporality of an imperial dynastic time. To a certain extent, it's like instantiating a kind of a prayer, a spell-like iteration of felicitous words. And then on the sake bottle, there is this interesting, earthier, charming poem, "An Old Tanuki Foraging for Sake." Perhaps this is how he passes the leisure hours on a rainy night. So I've included the part of the verse that you can see on the bottle in the photo and what you can't see in red, bracketed in red. So you can't see perhaps this is how he passes the leisure hours in this slide. I'd like to focus not on the haptic visuality of these objects as purely represented in the photograph on the screen, but rather as objects used and held in space and time, and to think about the kind of haptic sense perception involved in using Rengetsu ceramics. So not the embodied creator in the object, but of the user. The inscribed ceramic is haptic in the sense that it does not simply engage the user with a sense of touch. It involves more than a passive reception of feeling or a momentary tactile experience of the object. Interaction with it involves movement through space and time, a kinesthetic, because it is necessary to move the object to perceive it in its totality. Any ceramic object held in the hands already does this to a certain extent, but when a Waka poem is placed on an object in this way, it must be turned for the entire poem to be revealed. The words guide one through the kinesthetic experience of the work, and the vessel orchestrates the movements of the holder. And neither do the words exist isolated from space and time. The partial revelations of the poem are perceived and read in conjunction with other sensory information received from the texture and the physical material of the object. We can imagine moving our fingers over the surface to sense the depth of the incision that has been made. The inscribed writing as calligraphy adds yet another dimension to embodiment. The visual experience of East Asian calligraphy has long been theorized as rooted in the body, as movement recorded. Ancient calligraphic treatises in China abound with examples of how writing is related to the body, to the breath of the calligrapher, which is then captured on paper for future generations to retrace and, in a sense, to reanimate the calligrapher. The embedded body of the writer in the script anticipates a future symbiotic relationship with another. In a related way, we might even refer to Rengetsu's inscribed ceramics as fossils, with the clay as matter receiving the imprint of the organism. Here, not literally Rengetsu herself, but a fossilization of her fleeting existence on the earth as a physical being. The ceramic becomes a material witness to countless unrecorded histories and moments of past touch. Let's explore a little further the symbiotic or intersubjective relationship between calligrapher, potter, vessel, and the later user. Take, for example, how the user processes sensory information based on the perceived tactilic qualities of the vessel and then adjusts the body. Here we could venture into neuroscience and the realm of tactile perception and neurohaptics. It is worth considering what happens when in an encounter with these ceramics in that moment of fusion of multisensory domains. Rather than its usual use in art historical analysis, we might consider mimesis in terms of bodily mimesis, the body's instinctive move to mirror an object based on perception. When through touch one perceives a fragile, delicate object, for example, information is sent to the brain through nerve fibers connected to mechanoreceptors in the hand that send signals to the central nervous system, and the grip adjusts so that one handles the object lightly, differently, in an act of mind-body non-dualism. A thin-walled and seemingly fragile vessel could be described in stereotypically gendered terms as dainty, frail, feminine. These are in fact terms applied to women's art of the past. But it is possible to use a different vocabulary in describing these works. In terms of haptic dynamics, Rengetsu ceramics wield a certain power over the user, eliciting a bodily mimesis, demanding a light touch. They insist in their materiality on a gentle approach, if only for a moment. The vessel, its materiality, can provoke a reaction of humility, conformity to mutual physical states. It commands a certain kind of attention, like a whisper. It might therefore align with Rengetsu's sense of working with moral purpose, with her identity as a Buddhist nun or a person immersed in a Buddhist worldview. Then there's also the content of the poem. Sometimes the poem matches in interesting ways with the function of the vessel. And here you're looking at a wonderful piece in the exhibition that is a sake flask, which has this poem on it about fine sake in balance becomes an elixir for perpetual youth and long life. The shape of the vessel evokes a medicine container and is resonant with the word for kusuri, or medicine, here in the poem. It's also interesting to think about Waka on these vessels in terms of the notions of what Waka are doing in the 19th century, according to nativist theorists of literature, of which Rengetsu was a part. There are notions about kotodama, or the power of language, and the sacrality of the word, and tukana that is worth considering, but that I don't have time to go into today. Another issue is enunciation. There are qualities about her calligraphy that are very distinctive, including its legibility. Might we consider a kind of compassion of legibility? Is it legible, even this kind of vessel, to those who cannot see by projecting even a bit of a poem through touch? Not many linkages are between the graphs, as I mentioned, and that creates this kind of hyperlegibility in her writing, which also then makes us think about vocalizing, about the urge to vocalize when you encounter something that you can read. The voice was actually at the center of Waka Poetics, and this is directly where Waka poetry intersects with the body through enunciation. In fact, we can go back to the great preface of in China that dates to before the end of the first century, and the great preface to the Book of Odes, for example, which says, "The poem is that to which what is intently on the mind goes. In the mind it is being intent, coming out in language, it is a poem. The affections are stirred within and take on form in words. If words alone are inadequate, we speak it out in sighs. If sighing is inadequate, we sing it. If singing is inadequate, unconsciously our hands dance it and our feet tap it." And so there's a sense from the most ancient ideas about poetry that it should be a part of the body, should burst through from the mind into the body. And this also reminds me of a quote from Robert Pinsky, the former poet laureate, who said that in the ancient technology of verse, the column of air in a human body, shaped into meaningful sounds in the mouth and larynx, supplies the medium. He also said that poetry's highest purpose is to provide a unique sensation of coordination between the intelligence, emotions, and the body. So Rengetsu's Waka corpus, and here's just another close-up to show you another portion of the poem. Rengetsu's Waka corpus can be said to be characterized by a bold assertiveness of selfhood in the foregrounded voice of the poet and in the materiality of her work. The uniquely etched incisions of haptic poetry on her pottery, the unwavering distinctiveness of her calligraphic style, the consistent inclusion of her name and age on her works, and the way her collaborators often sublimate their own styles to match her artistic register. And yet this self-assertion need not be interpreted on an individualistic level. There are alternative notions of selfhood, at least when it comes to the artistic persona, for someone in her time and place that are more nuanced. it is clear that Rengetsu conceptualized her work as symbiotic with others. Therefore, we might consider the act of collaboration in this light, especially when it comes to joint works that she created with her protege, Tomioka Tessai, the artist, and others like this monk Wada Geshin as well. And here's a collaborative work with Tomioka Tessai, and shown in his studio, and just a glimpse of his style. So not unlike the scale and verve that you would find in Nantenbō, but someone that, with whom she collaborated closely and mentored. It's also clear that Rengetsu conceptualized her work as symbiotic with poetic personae who came before. So one crucial figure in this regard is the monk poet Saigyo, for example. And as I have suggested elsewhere, one of her most famous poems, in fact, reworks a classical poem by Saigyo. So here you're looking at it from another piece in the exhibition here. And this is really one of Rengetsu's most famous poems, and you can see it here, turned away at the inn. I take this kindness as grace, resting instead beneath the hazy moon and evening blossoms. Composed from the perspective of a traveler who has been denied shelter, the upper stanza, consisting of its first two lines, the kaminoku, introduces the poem's topic. So the topic, the callousness, the tsurasa of a person who does not lend their lodging, yado kasanu hito. In the lower stanza, the shimonoku, the uncharitable act of the innkeeper is transformed through the sentiment of the poet who, upon seeing the luminous vision of cherry blossoms bathed in hazy moonlight, decides to interpret it as a gift, nasake nite. They're making lemonade out of lemons, in other words. The verse presents a poet who is spiritually and aesthetically cultivated enough to realize in the moonlight scene the, quote, power, the moving power of things, mono no aware. It evokes the ah moment of surprise that precedes a heart being moved, which is then captured in the unique diction of Waka, in which the nativist scholar and philologist Motori Norinaga defined as the highest ideal of literary creation. I would suggest, however, that Rengetsu's poem contains shades of the poetic legacy of the monk poet Saigyo. The innkeeper in the poem, for example, need not merely be anonymous, but could be an oblique reference to the person who once rejected Saigyo, a woman identified in certain texts as a courtesan of Eguchi named Tae. And here's their exchange. On my way to Tennoji Temple, this is in the voice of Saigyo, it rained, so I asked for lodging at a place called Eguchi. On being refused, I composed, "It may be difficult for you to despise this fleeting world, but you begrudge me even momentary lodging?" And Tae, the woman, replies, "Because I heard that you despised the world, my only thought was, do not set your heart on this momentary lodging." In this famous exchange, Saigyo scolds the woman for what he believes to be a lack of generosity. The woman's rejoinder, however, clarifies that she had acted only with his virtue in mind, taking his Buddhist vows more seriously than the monk himself, and refusing to shelter him in a place where he might be led astray. And after the rejection, Saigyo, various things happen in different versions. This one was an episode that was recounted many times. But it links to numerous images of Saigyo beneath the blossoms, countless images, really. He almost becomes synonymous with the cherry blossoms and sitting and sleeping and even dying beneath them. So Rengetsu's poem could be seen as her own reworking of the Saigyo Eguchi courtesan exchange, especially given the continued currency of this well-known literary topos in the early modern period. Indeed, the poetic exchange between Saigyo and Tae took on a life of its own from the medieval period, embedded within the biographical tale of Saigyo, and elaborated on in anecdotal literature, and the episode was central to the no play Eguchi, which more than anything elevated the Eguchi courtesan's spiritual standing in the popular imagination. The play ends with a climactic scene in which the courtesan is revealed to be a manifestation of the Bodhisattva Fugen, who miraculously appears before the monk. The Buddhist message of the play, which emphasizes the eguchi courtesan's sacred identity, is in keeping with other works by No playwrights and the overall medieval No repertoire. So perhaps the tone of Rengetsu's poem is more rhetorically distant and is better characterized as didactic in nature. In this case, it could be translated as follows: the callousness of one who refuses to share her abode, take it as compassion, on a hazy moonlit night lying down beneath the flowers. Rengetsu's verse similarly hinges on the notion of how to interpret compassion, the word that she places in the center of her poem. It really is the pivot of the poem right here, nasake. It transforms the waka into an illustration of cause and effect. Importantly, Rengetsu does not explicitly signal a reference to Saigyo and the world rejecting with which he was so closely associated. She does not include the adjectival momentary, karino, before in, yado, which would have triggered immediate Buddhist connotations to the temporary lodging as a metaphor for impermanence. Instead, she focuses on the word nasake, which can mean both sentiment and compassion. This opens up the verse to a greater range of spiritual and aesthetic interpretation, nasake being equally crucial to the Buddhist moralistic poetics of Fujiwara Shunzei's understanding of impermanence, or to Motoori Norinaga's approach to mono no oware, and to the theorist Roan's that incorporated the term. Rengetsu thus masterfully universalizes her poem, allowing the topos of the refusal of lodging to be taken quite literally or to be subject to more metaphorical Buddhist readings. Taking the representation of cause and effect one step further, we might see the poem as a rendition of Saigyo's life story compressed within the two stanzas of the verse, so that the courtesan's compassionless compassion results in the monk breaking the samsaric cycle. In the legendary chronology of Saigyo's life, he achieved enlightenment dying beneath the flowers and moon, as illustrated in his death poem. My wish is to die in spring under the cherry blossoms on that day in the second month when the moon is full. At the time of her death in 1875, Rengetsu had been a Buddhist nun for over 50 years. She took vows in her early 30s after successive deaths of all of her children and one husband after the other. She changed her name to Rengetsu, Lotus Moon, at that time, and this name is central to her own death poem. My wish is to be in the next world, seated on a lotus flower, gazing at the cloudless moon above. In the poem, Rengetsu envisions herself already in the realm beyond, above the lotus flower. And you can see the relationship to the Saigyo poem. Rengetsu inscribed her death poem on at least one scroll, which you see here, in between an image of the moon above, here, and a self-portrait below. She portrays herself wearing the dark robes of a nun and seemingly with a walking stick in hand, an image of the peripatetic traveler, like Saigyo or Basho reborn. In the context of the death poem, the journey captured in the painting can only be interpreted as a spiritual one. The composition of Rengetsu's self-portrait with the poem sitting between two pictorial images is intriguing because it prefigures the creation of her death shroud, which is described in a remarkable anecdote recounted by the artist Tomioka Tessai, who was her protege from the time of his youth. When Rengetsu was in her 70s, she asked Tessai to paint her namesake imagery of lotus flower, Reng, and moon, Getsu, on a white cotton cloth she had made herself. She folded up the cloth, put it away, and Tessai soon forgot about what he had done. When Rengetsu passed away at the age of 85, Tessai realized that the women of the village washed her body and then had wrapped it in that very cloth. Beholding her enshrouded body, Tessai realized that between the images of the lotus and moon that he himself had painted years earlier, Rengetsu had inscribed her own death verse. Unbeknownst to Tessai, Rengetsu had quietly orchestrated one final collaboration between herself and her younger student, of which there had been many over the years. Between Tessai's Lotus and Moon pictures, Rengetsu brushed this poem that imagines herself after death between the lotus and the moon. Rengetsu graphically represented herself through the Buddhist name she had taken over 50 years before in her own calligraphic lettering, representing a fervent desire, as Tessai suggests, that her body and mind in this world and the next be pure and unsullied, like the lotus flower, and achieve ultimate illumination, symbolized by the clear moon. Poetically, graphically, and pictorially, Rengetsu rehearsed the negation and subsequent rebirth of a non-self. She did so in the most literal act of embodied inscription she had ever performed, using her own body covered in the shroud as the vehicle for her waka. For an artist most readily associated with embodiment, this final inscriptive act reads as a seamless relinquishing of embodiment anchored in a poem that transforms the self by taking the personhood of her name and inserting it exquisitely into the landscape of the next world, anticipating the dissolution of body and poem in the funeral pyre. Even her most visceral, substantial, embodied ceramic artifacts convey an ethos of the insubstantial, that there is, rather than the corporeal and imposing embodiment, there is an equal element of disembodiment, or what might best be called incorporeality, throughout her work. Thank you.